Good morning, everybody. Today we'll be talking about how to add ICD-10 diagnosis codes into Powerchart after October 1st. We'll be discussing three different ways. First, we'll go through how to add diagnosis codes into a note. So if I'm in Powerchart and I go to add a new Power Note, the first thing you'll notice is that once we get our note open, under the Impression and Plan section, where we used to have several quick picks where we could click on an ICD-9, those are now gone. So from the Impression and Plan section, to add a new ICD-10 code, we will click on the Diagnosis Code Search button right here. And that will open up our diagnosis control, which should look very similar to if we had just gone directly to diagnosis and problems and added from there. Now, many of you are used to using the add button to add your diagnoses, but it's much more convenient and the search options are much better if you use this search box here labeled IMO. What this will do is convert your ICD-10s into more common sense sentences. So let's say we had a car crash victim who had a femur fracture. So we will type femur and select broken femur. You can see it adds a code here, which is an ICD-10 code. You'll see this little icon here with the bullseye with the exclamation point. If you hover over it, you'll notice it says unspecified, which means we have not obtained the required specificity for that code. You can continue adding different diagnoses by continuing to type in the IMO search box. So let's say the patient also had a wrist fracture and a burn to his leg. We'll also say that this patient was a victim of a car crash or car accident. And let's say that in his workup we also found that he had hypertension as well as hyperglycemia. Now, to add these, I'm simply typing in the IMO box. Once I find the code that I am looking for, I can either scroll up and down using the arrow keys or highlight it using my mouse, or if it's the top option, I can simply hit enter and it will add the code in. So as you can see, I have all my codes added here. When we added hypertension, we actually got a specific ICD-10 code, so that is all we would need to do for that particular code. But any time you see the unspecified icon of the exclamation point inside the bullseye, that means that those codes need more detail. To activate the diagnosis assistant, which is what we will do to add more detail to our ICD-10 codes, you simply click on the bullseye icon right here. So for hyperglycemia, when I click on that icon, it will open up what's known as the diagnostic assistant. So just a brief walkthrough of the diagnostic assistant. You'll see the way this works is under here I have listed all of the different diagnoses that I added that were not specific enough for ICD-10 codes. The first one we are going to deal with is hyperglycemia. Here is the non-specific hyperglycemia ICD-10 code that it's already added. Based on that, it has tried to give us some options, and here for hyperglycemia we have 6 results, as you can see here. So if I want to just simply click one of these, because this is type 1 diabetes with hyperglycemia, if that's the case, I can actually just select it here. That will then replace this non-specific ICD-10 with this more specific ICD-10, and I can move on to the next option. If I hit next, it will actually bring up the next option here, so it moved me down to the next non-specific diagnosis of fracture of the wrist. Now you see for fracture of the wrist, I actually have 147 results, which is a little too much for me to try to scroll through and find the specific one I'm looking for. So in this case, I'll actually use these options to help narrow it down. So across the top here, what you will get are different options to help narrow the specificity of this code down. So in this case, I forgot to say whether it was left or right, so it's a left wrist fracture, and it's a closed fracture, and it is non-displaced. Once I get those three things selected, you can see I now have 11 results. And all I have left is I didn't say what specific bone of the wrist was broken. So if this is a fracture of the lunate and I select that, I now only have one result. It'll select it for me and I can go to my next option. Again, for broken femur, we have an unspecified code. We have over 500 results, so I don't want to wade through those, so I'm going to use my options across the top here to try to narrow it down. So again, I forgot laterality, and I forgot to mention whether this was closed or open, and whether it was displaced or non-displaced type fracture. So we'll say that this is a displaced comminuted fracture of the femoral shaft. You can see displaced comminuted fracture of the shaft of the right femur. Again, we're now done. We can move on to our next one. Burn of the leg. Again, in this one we only have 3 results, and essentially what we forgot to say whether it was left, right, or unspecified. So I can either choose my laterality here and it'll choose my code for me. If you accidentally clicked one of these and want to unselect it, you can just unselect it and it'll bring back all of the available codes. In this case, I want to say this was actually right-sided. I will highlight it here and click Next. Again, for car accident, we have 356 possible codes. So we need to narrow this down a little bit. So let's say this was the driver and he was injured. Just selecting that one option brings me down to 2 results, and that is non-traffic or traffic accident. As you can see, this is the only thing here under type that is not selected. So I can either select it up here and it'll give me that this was a traffic accident. You can see I'm done. I've gone through all of my non-specific codes and I hit save. And you can see all of these now are specific, other than the burn, which is specific. That's just a small glitch that should be resolved in the most updated version of Cerner. Now, if you're working in a note and you want to include these diagnoses in your note, you highlight whichever ones you wish to select. If supposedly I didn't want the hypertension and diabetes in my note, I would just select the last 4 and hit include. And you see it brings those 4 diagnoses directly into my note here. Now, that is identical to how you would add problems or how you would add diagnoses with ICD10s directly in the diagnoses control. So if you aren't adding these through a note, but you are used to going to the diagnosis control, again, you would go to IMO, and let's say this wasn't just a car accident, but actually a spacecraft accident. Again, you start typing spacecraft, you can see various options here. Let's say he was an occupant. You add the code by clicking on it. Again, we have our unspecified code. When you click that, it brings up the diagnosis assistant, and it just wants to know whether this was a forced landing or an explosion or a crash or a collision. Let's say in this case it was actually an unfortunate forced landing of the spacecraft. And again, our burn, and now you'll see that as a confirmed code. For those of you that are used to using the diagnosis and problems control on the M page that you see here, this works very similarly. Again, you can add both diagnoses and problems at the same time by changing this drop down here. For this, we will just be adding diagnoses for this visit. again, you go to the search term here and start typing. Let's say that we also found that this patient was hyponatremic. As I start typing hyponatremia, you will see my options there. I can either select one here, or if I just want the top option, I just hit enter. But let's say this was actually dilutional hyponatremia. Once we select that, you see that it's added dilutional hyponatremia, and that our specified versus unspecified options are down here along the left, and that was thankfully specific enough for ICD-10, so nothing more needs to be added. Let's say that this patient was actually in a watercraft accident. We type watercraft, you can see one of our options here is accident involving a watercraft. If we select that, we can now see that this was not specific enough. So again, by clicking on the bullseye, we open up our diagnosis assistant. We can see that we have one condition that we have to further specify, and that we have 69 results here. We need to say exactly what type of watercraft this was, apparently. So let's say this gentleman was just out for a nice fishing expedition, and then what actually happened to the boat. So whether this was machinery accident or struck by a falling object, perhaps this was also involved in our spacecraft accident here. Once we've selected everything, we're now down to one option, and we hit save, and we can say that now. We can see that now becomes specific enough. You can also open up the diagnosis assistant even for diagnoses that are specific. So for this dilutional hyponatremia, there was no other options. However, if I changed my mind and this wasn't actually just a car occupant and I wanted to change something here, I can reopen that diagnosis assistant and say this was an actual car passenger or occupant injured, and change the ICD10 from right here. So this was an accident with a pedal cycle, and again, you get all your options, and that will change the code in the background for you. So I hope that explains all your questions about how we will move forward after October 1st in ICD-10. As you can tell, there are some very entertaining diagnoses that we will have the opportunity to use. And if you have any further questions, you can contact IS. Thank you. Have a nice day.